The stench of cordite hung heavy in the air, a noxious cloud that clung to every surface like a bad omen. The ground beneath our feet was a morass of freezing mud, sucking the warmth from our boots with every step. The cacophony of war assaulted our eardrums, a deafening din of artillery fire, screams of the wounded, and the staccato rattle of machine guns. I remember the feeling of fear that gripped my heart, a cold dread that seeped into my very bones as I gazed out upon the carnage unfolding before us. The year was 1941, and the world was ablaze, the conflagration of war consuming everything in its path. As I stood there, frozen in the midst of chaos, I couldn't help but think of the events that had led us to this point. The Germans, with their blitzkrieg tactics, had been pushing deep into Soviet territory, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The Red Army, once thought to be invincible, was reeling, its defenses breached, and its people struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster unfolding before their eyes. But amidst the chaos and destruction, a subtle game of deception was being played, one that would ultimately prove to be the decisive factor in the outcome of the war. Operation Quicksand, a plan hatched by the Soviet High Command, was a complex web of deceit and misdirection, designed to confuse and disrupt the German war machine. The plan was to create a series of fake military units, complete with fake radio transmissions, false intelligence reports, and even fake troop movements, all designed to convince the Germans that the Soviets were preparing to launch a massive counterattack. The goal was to create a sense of uncertainty and doubt in the minds of the German commanders, to make them question their own intelligence and doubt their own eyes. But the Germans were not the only ones being deceived. The Soviet people, too, were being fed a constant stream of propaganda and misinformation, designed to boost their morale and convince them that the war was being won. The Soviet media was filled with stories of heroic victories and gallant sacrifices, of brave soldiers fighting against overwhelming odds, and of the inevitable triumph of the Red Army. But behind the scenes, a different story was unfolding, one of chaos, confusion, and desperation. As I looked around, I saw the remnants of a once proud army, now reduced to a ragtag collection of exhausted, hungry, and demoralized soldiers. The tanks, those mighty machines that had once been the symbol of Soviet power, now lay broken and still, their guns silenced, their crews dead or wounded. The aircraft, too, had been decimated, their wreckage scattered across the landscape like so many broken toys. The few planes that remained were largely obsolete, their engines outdated, their firepower inadequate. The Soviet T-34 tank, once the mainstay of the Red Army's armored divisions, was now a rare sight on the battlefield. Its 76.2 mm gun, once thought to be the most powerful in the world, was now outgunned by the German Panzer IV's 75 mm cannon. The T-34's armor, too, was no match for the German 88 mm anti-tank gun, which could penetrate its steel plating with ease. The Soviet planes, mostly outdated I-16S and I-153s, were no match for the German Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s, which dominated the skies. The Germans, on the other hand, were armed with the latest technology, their tanks and planes, the epitome of modern design and engineering. The Panzer IV, with its powerful 75 mm gun and advanced armor, was the backbone of the German armored divisions, while the Stuka dive bomber, with its screaming siren and deadly accuracy, was the terror of the Soviet infantry. The German 88 mm anti-tank gun, with its powerful recoil and advanced optics, was the most feared weapon on the battlefield, capable of knocking out even the most heavily armored tanks. But despite the overwhelming odds, the Soviets refused to give up. They fought on, driven by a fierce determination to defend their homeland, to protect their families and their way of life. They fought on, too, driven by a deep-seated hatred of the Germans, who had invaded their country, killed their people, and destroyed their cities. The Soviets fought on, fueled by a potent mix of patriotism, propaganda, and desperation, their bravery and sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. As I stood there, surrounded by the chaos and destruction of war, I couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would the Soviets be able to turn the tide of the war, to drive the Germans back and reclaim their lost territory? Or would the Germans continue to push forward, their blitzkrieg tactics and advanced technology proving too much for the Soviet army to handle? The outcome was far from certain, but one thing was clear. The war would be decided by the subtle game of deception being played out behind the scenes, a game of cat and mouse, of lies and half-truths, of misdirection and misinformation. The Soviet High Command, led by the enigmatic and ruthless Joseph Stalin, was playing a high-stakes game of poker, bluffing and deceiving the Germans at every turn. But the Germans, too, were not above using deception and misdirection to achieve their goals. The war was a complex web of intrigue and counter-intrigue, of spies and counter-spies, of codes and ciphers. It was a war of wits, as much as it was a war of guns and bullets. And the side that emerged victorious would be the one that was able to outmaneuver and outdeceive its opponent. As the battle raged on, I couldn't help but think of the words of the great Soviet general, Georgy Zhukov, who had once said, "The most important thing in war is to deceive the enemy, to make him believe what you want him to believe, and to do what you want him to do." The Soviets were certainly trying to deceive the Germans, but were they also deceiving themselves? Were they so caught up in their own web of propaganda and misinformation that they had lost sight of reality? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. The war would be decided by the subtle game of deception being played out behind the scenes, a game that would ultimately prove to be the decisive factor in the outcome of the conflict. The smell of cordite still hung in the air, an acrid reminder of the chaos and destruction that had unfolded before our eyes. The ground was still wet and muddy, the cold seeping into our bones. But we stood there, frozen in time, our eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the next move, the next twist in the subtle game of deception that was being played out before us. The war was far from over, and the outcome was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. The fate of the world hung in the balance, and the subtle game of deception being played out behind the scenes would ultimately prove to be the decisive factor in the outcome of the conflict. As the German forces launched their surprise attack on the Soviet Union, the stage was set for one of the most pivotal battles in the history of warfare. The Soviet army, despite being caught off guard, was determined to hold its ground and push the enemy back. The battle began in the early morning hours, with the Germans unleashing a barrage of artillery fire and aerial bombardments on key Soviet positions. The morning phase of the battle saw the Germans making significant gains, as their superior firepower and tactical prowess allowed them to break through the Soviet lines in several key areas. The Germans employed a tactic known as the Blitzkrieg, which involved rapid advances by armored columns, supported by air power and infantry. This tactic allowed them to quickly exploit weaknesses in the Soviet lines and push deep into enemy territory. The Soviet army, on the other hand, was hampered by communication failures and supply line issues, which made it difficult for them to respond effectively to the German attack. As the morning wore on, the Germans continued to push forward, using their tanks and aircraft to devastating effect. The Soviet army was forced to fall back, and it seemed as though the Germans were on the verge of a major victory here. However, as the afternoon phase of the battle began, the Soviets started to regain their footing. They launched a series of counterattacks, using their own tanks and aircraft to try and drive the Germans back. The Soviets employed a tactic known as the defense in depth, which involved creating multiple layers of defense to slow down the German advance. This tactic allowed them to absorb the German attack and slowly start to push them back. The Germans, on the other hand, were starting to experience supply line issues of their own, as their rapid advance had stretched their logistics to the breaking point. The afternoon phase of the battle saw some of the most intense fighting of the war, as both sides clashed in a series of brutal and bloody engagements. The Germans were equipped with some of the most advanced tanks of the time, including the Tiger II, which was heavily armored and mounted a powerful 88mm gun. The Soviets, on the other hand, were primarily equipped with the T-34, which was a more agile and reliable tank, but lacked the firepower of the Tiger II. Despite this, the Soviets were able to hold their own against the Germans, using their superior numbers and tactical prowess to offset the German advantage in technologies. As the battle raged on, the Germans began to experience communication failures, which made it difficult for them to coordinate their attacks and respond to Soviet counterattacks. The Soviets, on the other hand, were able to use their own communication networks to great effect, launching targeted counterattacks and exploiting weaknesses in the German lines. The Germans were also hampered by the Soviet use of flanking maneuvers, which allowed them to attack the German flanks and rear, causing chaos and disruption to the German supply lines. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had initially gained air superiority, but as the battle wore on, the Soviet Air Force, the VVS, began to make a comeback. The Soviets were equipped with aircraft such as the Yak-3 and the La-5, which were highly maneuverable and capable of holding their own against the German Me-109 and Fw-190. The VVS launched a series of raids against German airfields and supply depots, which further disrupted the German supply lines and made it difficult for them to maintain their advance. As the night phase of the battle began, the Germans were starting to tire, and their supply lines were becoming increasingly stretched. The Soviets, on the other hand, were gaining momentum, and their counterattacks were starting to push the Germans back. The night phase saw some of the most intense fighting of the battle, as both sides clashed in a series of brutal and bloody engagements. The Germans were equipped with night vision equipment and searchlights, which allowed them to continue fighting after dark, but the Soviets were able to use their knowledge of the terrain to great effect, launching surprise attacks and ambushes against the German forces. The Soviet use of partisans in guerrilla warfare also played a significant role in the battle, as they were able to launch attacks against German supply lines and communication networks, causing chaos and disruption to the German rear. The partisans were equipped with weapons such as the PPSH-41 submachine gun and the Mosin Nagant rifle, which allowed them to launch effective attacks against German troops. The Germans, on the other hand, were hampered by their own lack of experience in fighting against guerrilla forces, and they struggled to respond effectively to the Soviet partisan attacks. As the night wore on, the Germans were forced to fall back, and the Soviets were able to regain some of the ground they had lost earlier in the day. The battle was far from over, but it was clear that the tide was starting to turn in favor of the Soviets. The Germans had suffered heavy casualties, and their supply lines were in disarray. The Soviets, on the other hand, were gaining momentum, and their counterattacks were starting to push the Germans back. The stage was set for a long and bloody battle, as both sides clashed in a series of intense and brutal engagements. The Soviet use of technology also played a significant role in the battle, as they were able to employ weapons such as the Katyusha rocket launcher and the Su-152 self-propelled gun. The Katyusha was a highly effective weapon, capable of launching salvos of rockets against German positions, causing widespread destruction and chaos. The Su-152, on the other hand, was a powerful self-propelled gun, capable of delivering precise and accurate firepower against German tanks and fortifications. The Germans, on the other hand, were equipped with weapons such as the Panther tank and the 88mm anti-tank gun, which were highly effective against Soviet armor, but struggled to respond to the Soviet use of guerrilla warfare and partisan attacks. As the battle raged on, it became clear that the outcome would be decided by a combination of factors, including tactics, technology, and logistics. The Soviets had initially been caught off guard, but they had quickly regrouped and launched a series of effective counterattacks. The Germans, on the other hand, had initially gained the upper hand, but they were starting to tire, and their supply lines were becoming increasingly stretched. The stage was set for a long and bloody battle, as both sides clashed in a series of intense and brutal engagements. The outcome was far from certain, but one thing was clear. Only one side could emerge victorious, and the fate of the Soviet Union hung in the balance. The aftermath of Stalin's fatal gamble was a complex and multifaceted phenomenon that had far-reaching consequences for the Soviet Union, its people, and the world at large. The turning point of the war was a culmination of various factors, including the harsh Russian winter, the resilience of the Soviet people, and the strategic mistakes made by the German High Command. The Russian winter, with its freezing temperatures and snowy conditions, proved to be a decisive factor in the Soviet victory. The German army, unprepared for the harsh weather conditions, suffered heavily from frostbite, hypothermia, and other cold-related illnesses. The Soviet army, on the other hand, was better acclimated to the weather and was able to use it to their advantage. The winter weather also hindered the German army's ability to maneuver and supply their troops, giving the Soviet army a significant advantage. Another critical factor that contributed to the Soviet victory was the resilience of the Soviet people. Despite suffering heavily from the German invasion, the Soviet people remained committed to their cause and continued to fight with determination and courage. The Soviet government, led by Stalin, was able to mobilize the population and direct their efforts towards the war effort, resulting in a massive increase in industrial production and military recruitment. The German High Command's strategic mistakes also played a significant role in the Soviet victory. The German army's decision to launch a two-front war, fighting against both the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, proved to be a costly mistake. The German army was overstretched and unable to devote sufficient resources to either front, resulting in a weakening of their overall position. Additionally, the German army's failure to capture key cities such as Moscow and Leningrad proved to be a significant blow to their morale and overall strategy. The cost of the war was staggering, with both sides suffering heavy casualties and destruction of infrastructure. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million people, including military personnel, civilians, and prisoners of war. The German army lost an estimated 3.5 million soldiers, with many more wounded or captured. The war also resulted in the destruction of many cities, towns, and villages, leaving millions of people homeless and without access to basic necessities such as food, water, and shelter. The destruction of infrastructure was also significant, with many roads, bridges, and buildings destroyed or damaged. The Soviet Union's industrial base was also severely damaged. Many factories and manufacturing facilities destroyed or crippled. The war also had a significant impact on the Soviet Union's agricultural sector, with many farms and agricultural facilities destroyed or damaged, resulting in widespread famine and food shortages. The legacy of Stalin's fatal gamble is complex and multifaceted. The war marked a significant turning point in the history of the Soviet Union, as it resulted in the emergence of the Soviet Union as a superpower and a major player in international relations. The war also had a significant impact on the development of modern warfare, as it resulted in the introduction of new technologies and tactics, such as jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, and guerrilla warfare. The war also had a profound impact on the Soviet people, as it resulted in a significant increase in nationalism and patriotism. The war effort was seen as a collective effort, with everyone contributing to the war effort in some way. The war also resulted in a significant increase in the role of women in Soviet society, as many women took on new roles in the workforce and in the military. However, the legacy of the war is also marked by controversy and tragedy. The war resulted in the deaths of millions of people, including innocent civilians, prisoners of war, and soldiers. The war also resulted in the destruction of many cities, towns, and villages, leaving millions of people homeless and without access to basic necessities. The war also had a significant impact on the environment, as it resulted in the destruction of many natural habitats and ecosystems. The war also had a significant impact on the Soviet Union's relations with other countries, as it resulted in the emergence of the Soviet Union as a major player in international relations. The war marked the beginning of the Cold War, as the Soviet Union and the United States emerged as superpowers with competing ideologies and interests. The war also resulted in the formation of the Eastern Bloc, as the Soviet Union established a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. In the years following the war, the Soviet Union continued to play a major role in international relations, as it sought to expand its influence and promote its ideology. The Soviet Union also continued to develop its military capabilities, as it sought to maintain its position as a superpower. However, the Soviet Union's actions were also marked by controversy and tragedy, as it resulted in the suppression of dissent and the violation of human rights. The legacy of Stalin's fatal gamble is a complex and multifaceted phenomenon that continues to shape our world today. The war marked a significant turning point in the history of the Soviet Union, as it resulted in the emergence of the Soviet Union as a superpower and a major player in international relations. However, the war also resulted in the deaths of millions of people, the destruction of many cities, towns, and villages, and the suppression of dissent and the violation of human rights. As we reflect on the legacy of Stalin's fatal gamble, we are reminded of the devastating consequences of war and the importance of promoting peace and understanding. The war serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of diplomacy and international cooperation, as it highlights the devastating consequences of conflict and the importance of finding peaceful solutions to disputes. The war also serves as a reminder of the importance of protecting human rights and promoting democracy, as it highlights the dangers of totalitarianism and the importance of promoting freedom and justice. In the end, the legacy of Stalin's fatal gamble is a sobering reminder of the devastating consequences of war and the importance of promoting peace and understanding. As we look to the future, we must remember the lessons of the past and work towards creating a world where such tragedies can never happen again. The memory of the millions of people who died in the war, the destruction of cities, towns, and villages, and the suppression of dissent and the violation of human rights will forever be etched in our collective consciousness, serving as a powerful reminder of the importance of promoting peace, justice, and human rights. And so, we are left with a haunting question: what will be the cost of our next gamble, and will we ever learn from the devastating consequences of our actions?